The instant those words were out, "Mark, strong, please." I saw his face fall. I knew I'd crossed a line, but I was nowhere near ready for what his best friend was about to unleash. It was one of those Manhattan nights where the Pinot Grigio was flowing like the East River and the friendly ribbing had veered sharply into treacherous waters. The dinner party was supposed to be a sophisticated affair, a chance for Mark and me to mingle with his Wall Street buddies, people I could barely tolerate but endured for his sake. The conversation had started innocently enough. A bunch of guys in their 40s around a mahogany table in a Upper East Side brownstone, comparing notes on home repairs and office politics. It was all very "who's the alpha male," which I found utterly tedious and predictable. I'd heard these boorish exchanges a million times before, but tonight, something just snapped. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the slow burn of resentment that flared every time I looked at Mark. His slumped posture, the way he'd nervously chuckle at jokes that weren't funny, how he always seemed to shrink into the background even surrounded by his so-called closest friends. Whatever it was, it just spilled out. "Mark? Strong?" I actually laughed, the sound too brittle, too loud in the elegant dining room. Please, he couldn't change a light bulb without calling a handyman. A ripple of laughter went around the table, a mix of shock and amusement. Some of the men tried to stifle it, glancing awkwardly at Mark. But not Greg, of course. Greg, who always had to be the loudest guy in any room, let out a booming guffaw that filled the space, bouncing off the exposed brick walls. Mark's face went crimson, the color rising up his neck. He forced a tight, brittle smile, chuckling along as if the jab hadn't cut him to the quick. But I saw it in his eyes, the raw humiliation, the desperate scramble to maintain some shred of dignity. "Come on, Lisa," Jake said from across the table, his voice calm but slicing through the laughter like a shard of glass. "That's a little harsh, don't you think?" The room went instantly silent. All eyes swiveled to Jake. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench. Jake always had that presence, that quiet command, that self-assuredness. While the other guys at the table had softened with age, Jake still carried the hard edges of someone who worked with his hands. His broad shoulders and tanned skin were a testament to years spent running his construction business. I shrugged, trying to play it cool, like it was no big deal. Just being honest. It's not like Mark doesn't know it's true. Mark didn't say a word. He just stood abruptly, muttering something about needing some air, and practically bolted from the room, heading towards the small balcony overlooking the brownstones garden. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with unspoken judgment. I could feel their stares, heavy and accusatory. I wanted to snap at them, tell them to mind their own damn business, but instead I just reached for my wine glass and drained the rest of it. Jake was the one who broke the tension. He stood, grabbed the bottle of red from the center of the table, and walked over to me. Without a word, he refilled my glass, then leaned down, his voice low, just for me. "You don't pull punches, do you?" he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I looked up at him, thrown off balance by how close he was. "Someone had to say it," I replied, though my voice lacked the bravado I was aiming for. He straightened up, his gaze lingering on me for a beat before he walked back to his seat. The rest of the evening was a blur of strained conversations and forced smiles. Polite small talk hung in the air like smog over the city. Mark didn't come back inside, and I didn't go after him. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, but another part, the part that had been simmering with resentment for years, just couldn't muster the energy to care. It wasn't until later, after the other guests had started to filter out into the crisp New York night, that Jake approached me again. I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing out my glass, trying to avoid the awkward goodbyes. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, the earlier sharpness gone. I turned to face him, surprised by the genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. He stepped closer, close enough that I could catch a faint whiff of his cologne mixed with the subtle scent of sawdust and concrete dust, a working man's fragrance. "Mark will get over it," he said. "He always does." His words weren't comforting. If anything, they made me feel worse. Was that what our marriage had become? A series of little jabs and insults with Mark quietly absorbing them and me quietly resenting him for it? "Maybe he shouldn't," I said, more to myself than to Jake. He tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve in his head. "You know," he said after a moment, "for someone who's so tough on him, you don't seem all that happy yourself." The comment landed harder than I wanted to admit. I looked away, focusing on the water swirling down the stainless steel sink. "What's your point, Jake?" "My point," he said, stepping even closer, "is that you deserve to be with someone who makes you happy. Someone who knows how to handle a woman like you. I froze. The air between us crackled with an unexpected tension. When I looked up at him, his expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the intent in his dark eyes. "Jake," I started, but he cut me off. "Think about it," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You're too damn good to be stuck in a marriage where you're not appreciated." Before I could even formulate a response, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding like a drum solo and my thoughts racing like the subway at rush hour. The cab ride home with Mark that night was silent. He didn't ask me what Jake had said, and I sure as hell didn't offer to tell him. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the blur of neon lights and passing yellow cabs, I couldn't stop replaying Jake's words in my head. "You deserve better." For the first time in a long time, I wondered if he was right. Mark had left me in that dining room humiliated and alone, but Jake had stayed. And when he leaned in close to speak, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a flicker of feeling like I was the center of someone's world again. The next morning, Mark acted like the dinner party had never even happened. He left for work early, his coffee untouched on the kitchen counter, overlooking Central Park. I let him go without trying to make small talk. I told myself it was for the best, that he needed space to cool off, and frankly, I wasn't in the mood for another fight. But the silence he left behind was deafening, echoing through our expensive but sterile apartment. By noon, I was still in my pajamas, perched at the kitchen island with my laptop open, pretending to answer work emails. The truth was, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the previous night, to the way Mark had looked at me, hurt and small, and then, inevitably, to the way Jake had looked at me, like he could see right through all my carefully constructed layers. I told myself I was imagining things, that I'd read way too much into a few casual words and a lingering glance. But the memory of his voice, low and husky, whispering that I deserved more, it stuck with me, a persistent echo I couldn't shake. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. It was late afternoon when the knock came, a sharp rap that startled me. I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat, before padding over to the door and peering through the peephole. And there he was, Jake, standing on my doorstep with a bottle of wine in one hand and that crooked, disarming smile on his face. "Jake?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "What are you doing here?" "Figured you could use a drink," he said, holding up the bottle like it was the answer to all of life's problems. "Consider it an apology for last night." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't owe me an apology," he smirked. "Maybe not, but I doubt Mark's going to show up with flowers and an "I'm sorry" card." He trailed off, shrugging. I knew I should have told him to leave, that this was inappropriate, that my husband could walk in any minute, but instead I found myself stepping aside, opening the door wider. "Fine," I said. "One glass." Jake made himself comfortable in the living room like he owned the place, while I grabbed 2 wine glasses from the kitchen. By the time I joined him, he'd already uncorked the bottle and was pouring. "To surviving awkward dinner parties," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. I laughed despite myself, clinking my glass against his. "I'll drink to that." We talked for a while, the conversation surprisingly light and easy. Jake had a way of making people feel at ease, of drawing them in with his effortless charm and quick wit. He told me stories about his latest construction projects, about the eccentric clients who drove him crazy and the ones who made him laugh. For a little while, sitting there in my living room overlooking the city, I actually forgot about the tension with Mark, the growing cracks in our marriage. With Jake, it was easy to feel like the woman I used to be, confident, fun, maybe even a little desirable. But then the conversation shifted, as it always does. "So," Jake said, swirling the wine in his glass, his easygoing demeanor fading slightly, "are you and Mark okay?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Why do you ask?" He leaned back against the couch, his eyes fixed on me, suddenly serious. "Because last night didn't exactly scream happy marriage." I sighed, setting my glass down on the marble coffee table. "It's complicated." "Complicated," he repeated, a hint of amusement creeping back into his voice. "That's what people say when they don't want to admit things are falling apart." I opened my mouth to argue, to defend my marriage, but the words just caught in my throat because he was right. Things were falling apart, and no amount of pretending could fix that. Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the distance between us again. "You know, I've been Mark's friend for years. I've seen him at his best and his worst, but I've never understood why he doesn't fight for you." His words hit like a punch to the gut, stealing my breath. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the way he treats you. Jake said, his voice low and steady. Like you're just there. Like he's not terrified of losing you. My breath hitched. I looked away, staring at the abstract art on the wall, anything to avoid the intense scrutiny of his gaze. It's not that simple, I said quietly. Isn't it? He asked, his tone softening. You deserve someone who sees you, Lisa, someone who doesn't take you for granted. When I looked back at him, his expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the heat in his eyes. He wasn't just talking about Mark anymore. Jake, I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He set his glass down and moved closer, his knee brushing against mine. The air between us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. You're too good for this, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Too good to spend your life feeling like you're not enough. My heart was pounding against my ribs, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. As his hand reached out, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, I knew we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something irreversible. I shouldn't be here, he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of my cheek. Then why are you? I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment the city outside, the apartment, everything faded away, leaving only the two of us and the unbearable weight of the moment. Because I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice raw and unguarded, and I don't think I want to. I should have stopped him. I should have pushed him away, told him to leave before we did something we couldn't take back. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my breath catching in my throat as his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters, unsure if this was real or just a fleeting fantasy fueled by wine and loneliness. But then his hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss, and the floodgates broke. His kiss was nothing like Mark's. It was hungry, urgent, desperate, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for years. My hands found their way to his chest, his worn leather jacket rough beneath my fingertips. Lisa, he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with restraint. Tell me to stop. I couldn't. I didn't want to. Don't, I whispered, my fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. That was all the permission he needed. Before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch, his hands exploring my body like he was memorizing every curve, every inch of skin. His touch was firm yet gentle, confident in a way that made my head spin. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired, seen. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in him, a small voice in the back of my mind, a tiny flicker of guilt, reminded me that this was wrong, that we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. Jake, I breathed, my voice shaky. We can't. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark and clouded with something I couldn't quite decipher. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice raw. If that's what you want, tell me and I'll go. I opened my mouth, but no words came out because I didn't want him to leave. And in that moment, in the heat of his gaze, in the press of his body against mine, I wasn't thinking about Mark or the consequences or what this would mean for the future. All I could think about was Jake. When his lips found mine again, I stopped thinking, stopped worrying, stopped caring. Jake made me forget everything but the way he made me feel. I don't remember how we ended up in the den. One moment we were on the couch, bathed in the fading afternoon light streaming through the living room windows, and the next, Jake was leading me down the hallway, his hand warm and firm around mine. The door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly the world outside, the city that never sleeps, didn't exist. No husband waiting in the wings, no consequences looming, no judgment hanging over my head, just the sound of my breathing, heavy and uneven, and the weight of Jake's gaze as he turned to face me. The den was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a floor lamp tucked in the corner. It cast long shadows across Jake's face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw and the burning intensity in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, a little rough around the edges. I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and desire, a chaotic mix of right and wrong. I should have said no, I should have walked away, turned around and pretended this never happened. But the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel, like I was the only woman in the world, was impossible to ignore. For years I'd been invisible, taken for granted, a fixture in Mark's carefully curated life. And now, here was Jake, making me feel like I was the only thing that mattered. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely above a breath. "But I don't want you to stop." He didn't need any more encouragement. His hands were on me in an instant, sliding up my arms, pulling me close, his touch electric. When his lips met mine again, it was like a dam breaking. Everything I'd been holding back, all the frustration, all the loneliness, all the longing spilling out at once. The kiss was deeper this time, more urgent, more demanding, his tongue tangling with mine, a silent conversation of need and desire. His hands found my waist, his grip firm but not demanding, as if he was giving me the chance to take the lead, to pull back if I wanted to. I didn't hesitate. My fingers tangled in his hair, tugging slightly, and he groaned softly against my mouth, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Lisa," he murmured, his voice thick with want, "you're driving me crazy." The words sent a wave of warmth through me, melting away the last vestiges of doubt. I pressed closer, my body molding against his, fitting together like we were meant to be this way. His hands slid lower, tracing the curve of my hips, and I gasped as he lifted me effortlessly, setting me on the edge of the mahogany desk that dominated the room. For a moment, he pulled back, his breathing ragged as he studied me, his gaze intense and searching. His thumb brushed over my cheek, down to my lips, and I could see a flicker of conflict in his eyes, a battle raging beneath the surface. "This isn't just a one-time thing for me," he said, his voice steady but laced with a raw emotion that resonated deep within me. "You need to know that." His words hit me like a jolt, cutting through the haze of desire. This wasn't just about physical attraction for him, not just a fleeting moment of passion. It was something more, something deeper. And as much as I wanted to keep pretending this was just a reckless escape, I couldn't ignore the way my heart skipped a beat at his confession. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, honest for the first time in what felt like forever. "But I know I don't want it to stop." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, a promise in his eyes. "Then let me take care of you." The next moments blurred together in a haze of heat and urgency, a whirlwind of sensation and whispered words. His hands were everywhere, on my neck, my waist, my thighs, touching me in ways that sent sparks racing across my skin, awakening parts of me I'd forgotten existed. He kissed me like he was trying to memorize the taste of me, his lips trailing down my jaw to the hollow of my throat, each touch igniting a new fire within me. My dress slipped from my shoulders, pooling around my waist, and his hands found bare skin, the contrast of his rough palms against my softness, making me shiver with pleasure. I couldn't stop the small gasp that escaped my lips as his fingers traced the delicate lace of my bra. "Tell me if you want me to stop," he said, his voice low and steady, even as his touch grew bolder, more insistent. "I don't," I whispered, my fingers curling around the front of his jacket, pulling him closer, desperate for more. His mouth found mine again, and this time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, no looking back. It was raw and unrestrained, a collision of want and need that left me breathless, completely consumed. I wasn't prepared for how gentle he could be. Despite the fire that burned between us, he moved slowly, deliberately, like he was savoring every moment, every touch, every kiss. His touch was confident but patient, his lips brushing against mine as he whispered my name, Lisa, like it was the most natural thing in the world, a word he'd been longing to say. "Lisa," he murmured again, his voice a low rumble against my skin, sending vibrations through my entire body. "You're incredible." The words sent a wave of warmth through me, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from something I couldn't quite name, a mix of relief and rediscovery. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me like this, touched me like this, made me feel this alive, this seen. I let myself get lost in him, in the way he made me feel, like I was the most important person in the world, the only person in the room. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Mark or work or the endless list of responsibilities waiting for me back in the real world. There was only Jake and the way his hands and lips and voice pulled me back to life, back to myself. When it was over, we stayed tangled together in the quiet of the den, the only sound our breathing, slowly evening out as the adrenaline faded and the weight of what we'd done settled in the air. Jake's hand brushed against mine, his fingers lacing with mine in a gesture so tender, so unexpectedly gentle, it made my chest ache. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, concerned. I nodded, though the answer felt complicated, a messy tangle of emotions I wasn't ready to unravel. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. He tilted his head, his thumb brushing over my knuckles, a silent reassurance. "Neither do I," he said, his voice low, honest. "But I know I don't regret this." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I wanted to tell him I didn't regret it either, but the words felt too big, too heavy, too loaded with unspoken promises and unknown consequences. Instead, I just rested my head against his chest, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat soothe the chaos in my mind, a temporary anchor in the storm raging inside me. But the quiet didn't last. Somewhere in the back of my mind, through the haze of lingering desire and newfound fear, I registered the sound of the front door opening, the distinct click of the lock turning. My body tensed, every muscle locking up, and I sat up quickly, pulling my dress back into place, my heart pounding like a frantic alarm. "Mark," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice, cold and sharp. Jake's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he nodded, a silent understanding passing between us. He helped me gather my things as quickly as possible, his movements efficient and calm in the face of my rising panic. I smoothed my dress, running trembling fingers through my hair in a desperate, futile attempt to look normal, to erase the evidence of what had just happened. Jake opened the den door a crack, glancing cautiously down the hallway before turning back to me, his expression grim. "He's in the kitchen," he said quietly, his voice low and urgent. "Go upstairs. I'll handle this." I hesitated, my stomach twisting with guilt and fear, the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting off my frantic apologies. "I've got this. Just go." I nodded, trusting him, slipping out of the den and hurrying upstairs, my heart racing with every step, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of the apartment. I didn't know how much Mark had seen, how much he'd heard, but as I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands shaking in my lap, one chilling thought kept repeating in my mind, a dark premonition settling in my bones. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. When I finally looked into Mark's eyes that night, across the sterile white expanse of our kitchen island, I didn't see anger, I didn't see heartbreak, or betrayal, or even rage. What I saw in Mark's face, in the cold, calculating glint in his eyes, was far worse. Cold, methodical revenge. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, perched on the edge of the bed, staring out at the glittering cityscape spread out before me like a cold, indifferent map. I waited for the sound of Mark's footsteps, for the inevitable confrontation, the explosion of anger I knew was coming. But they never came. I heard Jake leave shortly after, the soft click of the front door closing quietly, without a single word exchanged between him and Mark. And I imagined Jake walking away with his usual unflappable confidence, the city lights reflecting off his broad shoulders, unshaken, unbothered, no matter the situation. But me? I felt like I was falling apart, piece by piece, crumbling from the inside out. When I finally crept downstairs in the early morning light, the apartment was eerily quiet, still, holding its breath. Mark's briefcase was gone, his car missing from the parking garage. For a fleeting moment, I let out a shaky breath, a pathetic whisper of hope, telling myself maybe he hadn't seen anything, maybe he didn't know. But that was just wishful thinking, a desperate attempt to cling to a fantasy. Mark didn't mention the night before when he came home later that evening. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't even acknowledge my existence beyond the bare minimum. In fact, he acted like nothing had happened at all, gliding through the evening with a chilling normalcy. He sat at the dinner table in the pristine dining room overlooking the city, ate the bland chicken I'd cooked without a word, and stared blankly at his phone, scrolling endlessly like I wasn't even there, wasn't sitting right across from him. That eerie calmness, that calculated indifference, it was worse than any shouting match, any accusations, any tears. It was a weapon, sharper and more effective than any raised voice. "Mark?" I ventured hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper as he poured himself a glass of scotch after dinner, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass. "Huh?" He didn't look up from his phone, his attention still glued to the screen. "About last night," I started, my voice trembling slightly, the words catching in my throat. He froze for just a fraction of a second, a subtle, almost imperceptible pause as he set the glass down on the polished countertop. But I caught it, that tiny hesitation, that flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. His head tilted slightly, and when he finally looked at me, his expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of polite disinterest. "Let's not do this right now, Lisa," he said, his tone as flat and emotionless as his face. It's been a long day. I wanted to push, to press him, to demand answers, to break through that wall of indifference, but something about the way he stared at me, a coldness in his eyes I'd never seen before, a chilling detachment that went beyond anger, made me stop. I swallowed the words, the questions, the apologies, and retreated, defeated into the suffocating silence of our apartment. The days that followed were tense, suffocating, like living in a pressure cooker. Mark acted like his usual self, going to work in his tailored suits, coming home to our Upper East Side apartment, eating dinner with me in strained silence, and sleeping in the same bed, separated by an invisible chasm wider than the Hudson River. But something was profoundly, irrevocably off. His politeness felt forced, each carefully chosen word laced with a hidden barb. His smiles were too tight, too brittle, never reaching his eyes. And every now and then, when he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him watching me, his gaze lingering, cold and assessing, like he was studying a specimen under a microscope. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just paranoia, guilt twisting my perception, making me see threats where none existed. I'd been caught up in something reckless and stupid, and now I was paying the price, my own mind turning against me, amplifying the fear. But then, on the fourth night, the fear materialized, solid and undeniable, in the form of a thick manila envelope. I found it sitting on the kitchen counter when I came downstairs the next morning, next to my ceramic coffee cup, a silent, sinister offering. At first, I thought it was just another stack of bills, another piece of junk mail, the endless stream of paper that cluttered our lives. But something about the weight of it, the way it sat there so deliberately placed, made my stomach clench with unease. When I opened it, my blood ran cold, a glacial wave spreading through my veins. Inside were photos. Photos of me and Jake. At first, they were innocuous enough, seemingly innocent. Me laughing, a genuine smile on my face as Jake poured me a glass of wine. The two of us talking in the living room, heads bent close together, an intimate moment captured from afar. But as I flipped through them, my hands starting to tremble, the photos became less innocent, more incriminating. A shot of Jake leaning in close, his hand brushing my hair, a gesture that now felt like a brand. Another of us in the den, the shadows obscuring the details, but the intimacy undeniable, his body pressed against mine as we kissed, the angle leaving no room for misinterpretation. And then, the final photo, the one that made my breath catch in my throat, the one that sealed my fate. A photo taken through the barely open den door, a grainy, voyeuristic shot that left absolutely no room for doubt, no space for explanation. I dropped the pictures like they'd burned me, scattering them across the granite countertop, my hands shaking uncontrollably, the glossy images mocking me with their silent accusation. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach, only to find Mark standing in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with his arms crossed, a predatory stillness in his posture. "Interesting photos, aren't they?" he said, his voice eerily calm, devoid of emotion, making it all the more terrifying. "Mark," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible. "I can explain." He held up a hand, silencing me with a gesture, cutting off my desperate plea before it even formed. "Don't bother," he said, his voice flat, dismissive. "I don't want to hear your excuses." "Then why?" I asked, my voice cracking, tears starting to sting my eyes. "Because," he said, cutting me off again, his voice rising slightly, a hint of something dangerous creeping into his carefully controlled tone, "I thought you should see what I've been dealing with, what I've had to watch." My stomach twisted painfully, a sharp, nauseating lurch. You took these?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "No," he said, almost amused, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his lips. "But I did install the security cameras, remember? Apparently, you forgot." The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs. The cameras, the damn security cameras, I'd completely forgotten about them. They'd been Mark's idea, a supposedly necessary safety precaution for our expensive apartment, though I'd always thought they were overkill, a sign of his controlling nature. "Why are you showing me these?" I asked, my voice shaking uncontrollably, tears now streaming down my face, blurring my vision. Mark's expression didn't change, remaining cold and detached. He reached into the envelope again and pulled out a small black USB drive, holding it up between his fingers, dangling it like a threat. "This," he said, his voice dropping lower, softer, more menacing, "is the video." I felt like I couldn't breathe, the air thick and heavy in my lungs. "Don't worry," he continued, his voice calm, almost conversational, but dripping with a venom that chilled me to the bone. "I haven't shown it to anyone. Yet." "Mark, please," I begged, taking a desperate step closer, reaching out a trembling hand towards him. "You can't?" He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the sound echoing in the pristine kitchen. "Oh, Lisa, I can, and I will if I feel like it." "What do you want?" I asked desperately, my voice breaking, raw with fear and humiliation. He smirked, setting the USB drive down on the counter, the small black rectangle suddenly seeming enormous, a symbol of my impending destruction. He folded his arms again, leaning back against the doorframe, his posture relaxed, confident, utterly in control. "I don't know yet," he said, his eyes locking onto mine, cold and predatory. "But for now, I suggest you start behaving yourself, unless you want your coworkers, your friends, your family to see exactly what kind of woman you really are." I felt tears sting my eyes, blurring my vision, but I blinked them back, refusing to break down in front of him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. "You're doing this to punish me," I said, my voice breaking, a fragile defiance in my tone. "No, Lisa," he said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, a chilling intimacy that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm doing this to remind you who's in control." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, a cold, hard truth. Control. That's what this was all about. I didn't recognize this version of Mark, the calm, cruel man standing in front of me. He wasn't yelling, wasn't breaking things, wasn't threatening to leave. He was methodical, calculating, and that, I realized with a terrifying certainty, made him far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. For the next few days, I lived in constant gnawing fear, every waking moment overshadowed by the weight of Mark's threat. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, I half expected it to be a text from Mark, a cruel taunt telling me he'd sent the video that my carefully constructed life was about to implode. Every time he looked at me across the dinner table, his gaze lingering just a moment too long, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like he could see every secret shame, every hidden desire, every buried regret. Jake called once, his name flashing across my phone screen, a painful reminder of everything I'd risked, everything I'd lost. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. I desperately wanted to tell him everything, to confide in him, to ask for his help, to somehow escape this nightmare. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that involving him would only make things worse, would only give Mark more ammunition, more leverage, more ways to destroy me. I was trapped, caught in a web of my own making, ensnared by my own recklessness, with no escape in sight, no way out of the suffocating darkness closing in around me. Mark didn't bring up the video again, didn't need to. The threat of it hung over everything, a constant, silent reminder of how easily he could shatter my world, how completely he held my fate in his hands. But what scared me the most wasn't the video itself, not really. It was the chilling realization that Mark had no intention of letting me go. This wasn't about revenge, not just about punishing me for my betrayal. It was about control, pure and simple, a twisted power play designed to break me, to bend me to his will, to make me his. I thought, foolishly, naively, that I could live with his threats, that I could find a way to endure, to weather this storm, to wait for it to pass. But the more he smiled that tight, brittle smile, the more he acted like nothing was wrong, the more I realized he wasn't going to stop. Not until he'd broken me completely, not until I was nothing more than a hollow shell, a puppet dancing to his strings. Mark didn't need to remind me of the video, didn't need to utter a single word about it. The knowledge that it existed, that it could be unleashed at any moment to destroy everything I'd built, was enough. He wielded that power silently, invisibly, his presence looming over every moment like a gathering storm cloud, a constant, oppressive weight pressing down on me, stealing my breath, suffocating my spirit. At first, I tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, to maintain the facade of normalcy, to pretend that my life wasn't crumbling around me. I went to work in my power suits, handled my meetings with a forced smile plastered on my face, and even made polite small talk with my coworkers, all while my world was collapsing, imploding from the inside out. But the weight of it all, the constant fear, the suffocating pressure began to crack me, to chip away at my carefully constructed composure. Every email notification pinging on my phone felt like a ticking time bomb, a potential message from Mark, a cruel reminder of his power. Every glance from him across the dinner table, every casual touch of his hand on my arm, felt like a knife pressing against my throat, a silent threat, a chilling promise. He didn't need to yell, didn't need to hit me, didn't need to raise his voice. His silence, his subtle smiles, his calm, calculated control, it was far more effective, far more devastating than any overt act of aggression. One evening, about a week after the initial confrontation, after the photos and the USB drive and the chilling ultimatum, I found him sitting in the living room, bathed in the dim glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch clutched in his hand. The lights were dimmed low, the flickering images of the TV screen illuminating his face in shifting shadows. He wasn't actually watching the show, some mindless crime drama. It was just background noise, another layer of carefully constructed normalcy. "Mark," I said, standing in the doorway, my voice trembling, barely a whisper. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence for a long, agonizing moment. "Mark," I repeated, my voice a little louder, a little firmer, desperation giving me a sliver of courage. "I can't do this anymore." That got his attention. He finally set the glass down on the marble coffee table, the crystal clinking softly against the hard surface, and turned to face me, his expression unreadable, a carefully blank canvas. "Do what, Lisa?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This," I said, gesturing vaguely around the opulent living room, the expensive furniture, the panoramic city views, the gilded cage we called home. "Living like this, waiting for you to ruin me." He leaned back against the plush velvet couch, resting an arm along the back, his posture relaxed, almost languid, but his eyes, when they met mine, were sharp, assessing, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Ruin you? Is that what you think I'm doing?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild, a dangerous undercurrent beneath the surface. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by a desperate anger, a flicker of defiance. "You're punishing me. You're holding this over my head so you can control me." He tilted his head slightly, studying me, his gaze intense, unsettling, like I was a complex equation he was trying to solve, a puzzle he was meticulously piecing together. "You think you're the victim here, Lisa?" he asked, his tone suddenly sharp, the carefully constructed facade cracking, revealing the raw anger beneath. "You humiliated me, Lisa. You betrayed me in my own home with my best friend. And now you're upset because I didn't just roll over and take it?" "I made a mistake," I admitted, my hands trembling, my voice shaking again, the fragile defiance fading away. "I know that, but this," I gestured again, encompassing the entire suffocating situation. "What you're doing, it's not about us anymore. It's not about our marriage. It's about power. It's about you wanting to control me." Mark's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching in his cheek, and for a fleeting moment I thought he might snap, might unleash the rage I knew was simmering beneath the surface. But then, just as quickly, he regained control, his movements slow, deliberate, chillingly calm. He stood, his movements fluid and graceful, and took a step toward me, closing the distance between us, invading my personal space, the air suddenly thick with unspoken threat. "You want to talk about power, Lisa?" he said, his voice dropping low, menacing, a predatory purr that sent shivers down my spine. "You had all the power, Lisa. All of it. The night you decided to sleep with Jake. You had the power to destroy this marriage, to obliterate everything we'd built together. And you did. I'm just making sure." He stepped closer, his breath warm against my face, his eyes boring into mine. "I'm just making damn sure you don't destroy anything else." I backed away, my heart pounding against my ribs, fear constricting my throat, making it hard to breathe. As he closed the distance between us, I felt trapped, cornered, like a mouse caught in a cage. "You don't have to do this, Mark," I whispered, my voice pleading, desperate. "Don't I?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine, holding me captive in his gaze, his expression cold, unwavering. "You made your choice, Lisa. Now you get to live with it." I couldn't sleep that night. The weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me, crushing me. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the darkness of the bedroom amplifying the chaos in my mind, my thoughts racing, frantic, desperate, searching for any glimmer of hope, any possibility of escape. I couldn't stay here not like this, not with him holding that video over me, wielding it like a weapon, slowly, methodically dismantling my life. But leaving wasn't an option either, not really. If he released that video, it would ruin me, destroy everything I'd worked for, everything I valued, my career, my reputation, my carefully constructed life. I needed help. Desperately. The thought of calling Jake, of reaching out to the one person who might understand, who might be willing to help, made my chest tighten, a painful knot of fear and longing. I hadn't spoken to him since that night, hadn't even answered his text messages, paralyzed by fear, terrified of what Mark might do if he found out, if he discovered any connection between us. But as the hours dragged on, stretching into the long, dark night, as the weight of my isolation became unbearable, I realized I didn't have a choice. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The next day, while Mark was at work, locked away in his Wall Street office, I sat in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store on the Upper West Side, staring at my phone, my fingers hovering over Jake's name in my contact list. My chest was tight, my breath shallow, anxiety churning in my stomach like a storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed the call button. "Lisa?" he said after the first ring, his voice laced with relief, a warmth that cut through the cold fear gripping me. "I was starting to think you weren't going to talk to me again." "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking, tears welling up in my eyes. "I didn't know what to say." "You don't have to apologize," he said gently, his tone reassuring, understanding. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I hesitated, my throat tightening, the words catching in my throat, choked by emotion. "No," I admitted, finally breaking down, the dam of fear and control cracking, the truth spilling out. "No, I'm not." "What happened?" he asked, his tone sharp with concern, the gentleness replaced by a protective urgency. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady myself, trying to find the words to explain the nightmare my life had become. "Tom knows about us," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush, a desperate confession. "He has the video." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched out, agonizingly, into an eternity. When Jake finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the easygoing charm replaced by a steely resolve. "What do you mean, he has the video?" "I mean," I said, my voice cracking, tears streaming down my face now, unchecked, unstoppable. "He recorded us. He's been holding it over my head ever since. I don't know what to do, Jake. I'm trapped." "I'll take care of it," he said immediately, his voice firm, decisive, unwavering. "No," I said quickly, panic rising again, sharper, more intense than before. "No, you can't. If you confront him, if you do anything, he'll use it against both of us. He'll release the video. He'll destroy us." "Then what do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice softening again, the steel replaced by a tender concern. "I don't know," I whispered, sobbing now, the tears flowing freely, a torrent of fear and despair. I just needed to tell someone I can't do this alone." "You're not alone, Lisa," he said firmly, his voice a lifeline in the storm. "You're not alone. We'll figure this out, together. I promise." That night, for the first time in weeks, a strange sense of calm settled over me, a fragile peace amidst the chaos. Knowing that Jake was on my side, that I wasn't completely powerless, that someone was willing to fight for me, offered a sliver of hope, a faint light in the overwhelming darkness. But that fragile calm didn't last long. When I got home that night, Mark was waiting for me. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the same cold, sterile kitchen where he'd first revealed his power over me, the USB drive sitting in front of him, a silent, ominous presence. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual, but his eyes, when they met mine, were cold, hard, assessing, betraying the casual facade. "Running errands," I said, keeping my voice steady, trying to project an outward calm I didn't feel, praying he wouldn't see the fear trembling beneath the surface. "Stopped to get groceries." I held up the plastic bag I'd grabbed from the store, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. He nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the polished table, his gaze unwavering, piercing. "You know, I've been thinking about our situation," he said, his voice still casual, almost conversational, but laced with an undercurrent of menace that sent a chill down my spine. "And I've decided something." "What's that?" I asked wearily, bracing myself for the inevitable blow, for the next twist of the knife. "I think it's time we renegotiate the terms of this marriage," he said, his lips curling into a faint, cruel smile, a predatory glint in his eyes. My stomach dropped, plummeting into a bottomless pit of fear and dread. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible. "I mean," he said, leaning forward, closer across the table, his gaze locking onto mine, holding me captive. "If you want me to keep this little incident between us, if you want to keep your precious reputation intact, you're going to have to start pulling your weight around here." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice shaking uncontrollably, tears blurring my vision again. "It means," he said, his tone hardening, becoming firm, absolute, devoid of any pretense of casualness. "You're going to do exactly what I say, when I say it. No more backtalk, Lisa. No more attitude. You're going to be the perfect wife, Lisa. The perfect, obedient wife. Or," he paused, letting the threat hang in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, "everyone's going to know exactly what kind of woman you really are." The weight of his words crushed me, leaving me speechless, breathless, utterly defeated. As I sat there, staring at the man I'd once loved, the man who now held my life in his hands, I realized with a chilling certainty that he wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let this go. And if I didn't find a way out, if I didn't somehow break free from his suffocating control, he was going to destroy me, completely and utterly. Mark thought he'd broken me, that I'd crumble, fall in line, and accept his twisted rules, his suffocating control. He thought he'd reduce me to nothing more than a puppet, dancing to his strings, a perfect, obedient wife. But the moment I stepped outside that apartment door the next morning, the crisp New York air filling my lungs, I knew there was no going back. There was no more pretending. It was time to take control of my own life, to fight back, to reclaim my own destiny, no matter the cost, no matter the risk. The morning after Mark's chilling ultimatum, I sat at the kitchen table, the same sterile, cold kitchen that had become my prison, staring at the same USB drive he'd used to hold me hostage, the small black rectangle a symbol of my captivity. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, forgotten, as I replayed his words in my head over and over again, the chilling echo of his threat, the perfect wife, or everyone will know exactly what kind of woman you really are. I knew what he wanted. He wanted control. Absolute, suffocating, all-consuming control. And for the past week, terrified and defeated, I'd given it to him, willingly, tragically. I'd cooked his meals, smiled politely across the dinner table, endured his cold, calculated presence, even laughed weakly at his dry, humorless jokes when he brought up work, playing my part, the perfect, obedient wife. I'd played it so perfectly, so convincingly, that even he seemed to believe it, seemed convinced that I was broken, that I'd finally surrendered. But I wasn't broken. I was waiting. I was biding my time. I was plotting my escape. That afternoon, under the bright, unforgiving New York sun, I met Jake. I chose a public park, a small patch of green amidst the concrete jungle, somewhere quiet but open, where I wouldn't feel trapped, wouldn't feel like the walls were closing in. I told him everything, pouring out the whole story in a rush of words, the fear, the humiliation, the suffocating control, Mark's threats, the USB drive, the photos, the unbearable weight of pretending, of living under his thumb. Jake sat silently, his jaw clenched tight, his expression grim, his fists tightening on the picnic table between us as he listened, absorbing every word, every detail of my nightmare. When I finally finished, the words trailing off into a choked silence, he leaned back against the wooden bench, letting out a slow, controlled breath, a visible effort to contain his anger. "He's a bastard," he said finally, his voice low, raw with fury. "A manipulative, spineless bastard." "You're not wrong," I said, managing a weak, humorless smile, a bitter acknowledgement of the truth. He leaned forward again, his voice low, urgent, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a jolt of hope through me. "You don't have to stay, Lisa," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. "You don't have to let him control you." "I don't have a choice," I whispered, shaking my head, tears pricking at my eyes again, the familiar despair washing over me. "If he releases that video, it'll ruin me. I'll lose everything." My voice cracked, the words choked with fear. My job, my reputation, my entire life. "Then we take the video," Jake said, his tone resolute, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination that mirrored my own growing desperation. I stared at him, my heart racing, a flicker of hope igniting within me, a spark of defiance against the overwhelming darkness. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid to even voice the possibility of escape. "I'm saying we get the USB drive," he said, his tone firm, unwavering. "We destroy it, destroy every copy he has. We take back the power." "It's not that simple," I said, shaking my head again, doubt creeping in, extinguishing the fragile spark of hope. Mark isn't stupid. He probably has backups, cloud storage, hidden files. He's thought of everything. Jake reached across the table, his hand covering mine, his touch warm, strong, grounding me, anchoring me to the present moment, to the possibility of action. Then we find them all, he said, his voice unwavering, his gaze intense, locking onto mine. And if we can't, if there are backups we can't find, we make damn sure that bastard knows he's not the only one who can play dirty. We fight back, Lisa. We take back your life. I didn't know if it was Jake's unwavering confidence, his fierce protectiveness, or my own growing desperation. The sheer impossibility of continuing to live under Mark's suffocating control, but something inside me shifted. A dormant strength awakening, a spark of defiance igniting into a flame. I nodded slowly, my voice barely audible, but filled with a newfound resolve. Okay, I said quietly, my gaze meeting his, a silent pact forming between us. Okay, let's do it. But we have to be careful. If Mark catches on, if he even suspects what we're planning. Jake squeezed my hand, his grip firm, reassuring. He won't, Jake said firmly, his eyes blazing with determination. Not if we're smart. We'll be smarter. We'll be faster. We'll take back your life, Lisa. I promise you that. That night, I went home, back to my gilded cage, and played my part again, the perfect, obedient wife. Mark was sitting on the couch in the dim, sterile living room, watching one of his mindless crime dramas, a glass of scotch swirling in his hand, the amber liquid catching the faint light. "You're late," he said without looking at me, his eyes glued to the flickering images on the screen, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. I stopped in the doorway, my heart pounding against my ribs, fear tightening its grip around my throat. "I stopped to get groceries," I said, keeping my voice steady, trying to mask the tremor of fear, holding up the plastic bag, the same pathetic prop from earlier, the same flimsy attempt at normalcy. He grunted in response, a dismissive sound, his eyes remaining fixed on the T-screen, his attention seemingly elsewhere. I set the bag down in the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly, and glanced at the USB drive, still sitting on the counter in the same spot where he'd left it days ago, a constant, silent threat. It hadn't moved since the night he'd first revealed it, since the moment he'd shattered my life. My fingers itched to grab it, to snatch it up, to throw it down the garbage disposal, to smash it into a million pieces, to erase it from existence, to be done with it, to finally break free from its suffocating power. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I knew I needed a plan, a strategy, a way to outsmart him, to reclaim my life without triggering his wrath, without unleashing the devastating power he held over me. I needed to be smart. I needed to be patient. I needed to be careful. And I needed Jake. The next day, a Tuesday, I waited until Mark left for work, until I heard the elevator doors close and the apartment fall silent, before I began my search. I started with his home office, the meticulously organized space that reflected his controlling nature, the room where he conducted his business, where he plotted his strategies, where he now held my life captive. I rifled through drawers, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins, checking every file, every folder, every hidden compartment. I checked his computer, sifting through endless files and folders, searching for any mention of backups, any trace of the video, any clue to its hiding place. I even dug through the filing cabinets, meticulously labeled and organized, but filled with nothing but mundane documents and business records. Frustrated, my heart pounding with a growing sense of panic, I moved to the bedroom, our sterile, impersonal bedroom, a space that now felt more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. I checked under the bed, my hands groping in the dusty darkness, finding nothing but forgotten shoes and stray socks. I searched in the walk-in closet, meticulously organized by color and season, rifling through drawers, checking behind clothes, finding nothing but expensive suits and neatly folded shirts. I checked every drawer and box I could find, every nook and cranny, every possible hiding place, my desperation growing with each empty space, each fruitless search. And then, tucked away in the back of his nightstand drawer, hidden beneath a stack of neatly folded handkerchiefs, I found it. A small, unassuming black external hard drive, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and fear. I snatched it up, my hands trembling, and rushed back to his office, plugging it into my laptop, my fingers clumsy and shaking as I navigated the unfamiliar interface. Sure enough, there it was. A folder labeled simply Home Security, easily missed, easily overlooked, deliberately innocuous. I opened it, my stomach twisting into knots, nausea rising in my throat as I saw the files, the videos, the photos, everything he'd recorded, everything he'd used to blackmail me, laid bare before my eyes, raw and incriminating. My hands shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse, I copied the entire folder to a small flash drive, a tiny sliver of plastic holding the key to my freedom, the evidence of my betrayal, the weapon Mark had wielded against me. The entire time, as the files transferred, as the progress bar slowly crept across the screen, I was terrified, convinced that Mark would walk in at any moment, would catch me in the act, would unleash his fury, his revenge. But somehow, miraculously, I managed to complete the transfer, to copy every file, every photo, every video onto the small flash drive. I ejected the hard drive, carefully placed it back in its hiding place, tucked away in the back of his nightstand drawer, hidden beneath the handkerchiefs exactly as I'd found it. Then, clutching the flash drive in my hand, my heart still racing, my breath still shallow, I fled the office, fled the apartment, fled the gilded cage that had become my prison. That evening, under the cloak of darkness, I met Jake again, in the same park, on the same bench, the familiar setting a small comfort in the midst of my fear and uncertainty. I handed him the flash drive, the small plastic rectangle feeling heavy in my palm, weighted down by the burden of its contents. "This is everything," I said, my voice shaking, barely above a whisper, the words catching in my throat. At least, everything I could find. On the hard drive. Jake nodded, his expression grim, his jaw clenched tight, slipping the flash drive into his pocket, his movements deliberate, decisive. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice firm, reassuring, his gaze locking onto mine. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice still trembling, the fear still clinging to me, a persistent shadow. "Make sure Mark doesn't have anything to hold over you anymore," he said simply, his eyes unwavering, his gaze promising protection, freedom, a future beyond the suffocating control of my marriage. When I got home that night, back to the sterile silence of the apartment, Mark was waiting for me. He was sitting in the living room, in the dim light, his silhouette a dark shape against the panoramic city view, a silent sentinel guarding his territory. He was sitting in the same spot he'd occupied every night since he'd revealed his power, since he'd begun his campaign of control. He was waiting, watching, always watching. He looked calm. Too calm, unnervingly calm, and that, more than anything else, terrified me. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual, but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion, a subtle hint of menace. I froze in the doorway, my heart leaping into my throat, fear constricting my breath. "Out," I said, keeping my voice steady, trying to project an outward confidence I didn't feel, praying he wouldn't see the fear trembling beneath the surface. "Out where?" he pressed, his tone sharpening, the casual facade cracking, revealing the cold, hard edge beneath. "Running errands," I said, repeating the same lie, the same pathetic excuse, brushing past him, trying to avoid his gaze, trying to escape the suffocating tension of the room. He grabbed my wrist, his grip tight, painful, stopping me in my tracks, his fingers digging into my skin. "Don't lie to me, Lisa," he said, his voice low, menacing, a whispered threat that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs, fear paralyzing me, my breath catching in my throat. I met his gaze, forcing myself to look him in the eyes, trying to project strength, defiance, anything but the terror that threatened to consume me. "I'm not lying," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but filled with a desperate resolve. For a long, agonizing moment, he stared at me, his gaze unwavering, intense, his grip on my wrist tightening just enough to hurt. A silent warning, a subtle demonstration of his power. Then, slowly, deliberately, chillingly, he released me, his fingers sliding off my skin, leaving behind a lingering coldness, a phantom ache. "Be careful, Lisa," he said quietly, his voice a soft, deadly warning, a chilling promise of retribution. "You're playing a dangerous game." The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and fear, a tense, suffocating waiting game. Jake kept his word, disappearing into the digital shadows, working his technological magic, wiping every file on the flash drive, erasing every trace of the video, leaving no digital footprint, no evidence of Mark's blackmail, no weapon for him to wield against me. I felt a strange mix of relief and fear, a tentative sense of freedom battling against a deep-seated dread. Relief that the worst was over, that the video was gone, that Mark had lost his leverage, but fear of what he would do when he realized he'd lost his control, when he discovered that his power had been stripped away, when he understood that I was no longer afraid. But when the confrontation finally came, when the inevitable explosion erupted, it wasn't what I expected. It happened on a Sunday morning, a bright sunny New York morning, the city outside sparkling, oblivious to the storm brewing inside our apartment. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, the lukewarm liquid tasting like ash in my mouth, when Mark walked in, his presence filling the room with an unnerving stillness. He looked calm, too calm, dangerously calm, and that, more than anything else, terrified me. "You've been busy," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational, but his eyes, when they met mine, were cold, hard, devoid of any warmth, any emotion. I froze, my hand clutching the coffee cup, my heart pounding against my ribs, fear constricting my breath. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, pretending ignorance, hoping against hope that he didn't know, that he hadn't discovered my betrayal. He smirked, a cruel, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips, reaching into the pocket of his tailored trousers and holding up his phone, the screen illuminated, the image on the screen sending a jolt of ice through my veins. "I had backups, Lisa," he said, his voice dripping with a chilling triumph, a predatory satisfaction. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" My blood turned to ice, my breath catching in my throat, the fragile hope I dared to feel shattering into a million pieces. "But don't worry," he said, setting the phone down on the table, the screen still glowing, the image a silent accusation, a damning piece of evidence. "I'm not going to ruin you. Not yet, anyway." He leaned closer, across the table, his eyes locking onto mine, cold and predatory, a hunter toying with his prey. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling, raw with fear and despair, the fight draining out of me, leaving me empty, defeated. He leaned closer, his face inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin, his eyes boring into mine, holding me captive. "I want you to remember who's in charge, Lisa," he whispered, his voice low, menacing, a chilling reminder of his power. "I want you to think long and hard," he paused, letting the threat hang in the air, suffocating and oppressive, "before you ever try something like this again." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me breathless, suffocated, gasping for air. Mark wasn't just holding the video over me anymore, not just threatening to ruin my reputation, my career, my life. He was holding my entire existence in his hands, wielding absolute power, controlling every aspect of my life, every breath I took, every thought I had. And I realized then, with a chilling certainty, that he wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to let go, not until I was completely under his control, not until I was utterly and irrevocably broken. That was the moment I made my decision, the moment I knew what I had to do, the moment I chose my own path, my own destiny. The next morning, while Mark was at work, locked away in his office, oblivious to my plans, oblivious to my escape, I packed a bag, a small, discreet suitcase, filling it with only the essentials, the bare minimum I needed to survive. I left while he was gone, while the apartment was empty, silent, and still, taking nothing but my clothes, my toiletries, my laptop, and the flash drive Jake had given me, the empty flash drive, a symbol of my reclaimed freedom, a promise of a new beginning. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan, didn't have a destination in mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't spend another day, another hour, another minute, trapped under Mark's suffocating control, living in fear, waiting for the inevitable destruction. As I drove away from the apartment building, leaving behind the gilded cage, leaving behind the wreckage of my marriage, leaving behind the man who had become my tormentor, a strange sensation washed over me, a mixture of fear and exhilaration, of loss and liberation. The weight on my chest began to lift, slowly, tentatively, like a dark cloud parting to reveal a sliver of sunlight. I wasn't free, not yet, not completely. But for the first time in years, for the first time since I'd become trapped in the suffocating confines of my marriage, I felt like I was taking control of my own life, making my own choices, charting my own course. And no matter what came next, no matter the challenges, no matter the risks, I knew one thing for sure, with a deep, unwavering certainty. I wasn't going to let Mark win. I wasn't going to let him break me. I was going to survive. I was going to rebuild my life. I was going to be free.